the night my husband decided to let me take the fall. He did it in French, across a dinner table, with me sitting right there, pouring the wine. He thought I didn't speak French. He thought a lot of things about me that weren't true, but that was the one that ended him. Let me set the table for you, because the table is the whole world of this story. We were in a private dining room on the 40th floor of a hotel in one of the World Cup host cities. The kind of room you do not get into without a name or a fortune. And my husband had both. Damien Cross, 48 years old, silver at the temples, charming in the particular way of men who have never once been told no and do not intend to start. To the world, he was a sports investment consultant. To the small number of people in that room, he was something else entirely. He ran the largest match-fixing operation moving through the tournament, an operation that turned the most watched sporting event on Earth into a machine for laundering and multiplying an almost unimaginable amount of money. And I was his wife, Mara. The decoration, that is the word they used, his partners, when they thought I couldn't hear them, which was always, because I had spent 4 years being so quiet and so ornamental that they had stopped seeing me as a person who could hear at all. The decoration, the pretty wife who poured the drinks and smiled at the right moments and knew nothing about the business. Because Damien liked it that way. Because a wife who knew nothing could never testify to anything. There were 4 of them at dinner that night, plus me. Damien, a woman named Renata Vasquez who ran the betting side, elegant and cold, the only person in the operation Damien was actually afraid of. A man called Nico, Damien's right hand, loyal as a knife. And a banker whose name does not matter yet, the one who moved the money through accounts in 6 countries. They talked business over dinner, the way the very powerful do, openly, because the staff didn't count and the wife didn't count and the room was secure. And midway through the second course, when a problem came up, an investigation, a journalist sniffing too close, a risk that the whole structure might be exposed, Damien Cross leaned toward Renata Vasquez and solved it. In French, smiling at me as he poured himself more wine. "If it comes apart," he said, "we give them Mara. She signed things. Her name is on accounts she never read. She's the perfect one to hand over. Because she genuinely knows nothing, so she can't bargain her way out by informing. We let them think she ran it. I walk away clean. And the grieving husband testifies that his foolish wife kept secrets from him." Renata Vasquez looked at me, the decoration, pouring the wine, and answered him in French, "She's that stupid that she'd let you put her name on everything and never look? She's that trusting." Damien said, "It's her best quality." And I smiled, and I set down the bottle, and I asked, in English, if anyone would like coffee. Here is what none of them knew. I speak French. That is the small thing. The large thing, the thing that was going to take all of them apart, is what I had been doing for 4 years while they called me decoration. I had been reading the accounts. Every one. The accounts Damien put my name on and assumed I never looked at. I had read all of them, completely. And I had kept every number, every transfer, every name, every account in every one of those 6 countries. In the one place Damien Cross never thought to secure. He thought my name on those accounts made me the perfect fall guy. He had it exactly backwards. My name on those accounts made me the only person alive who could see the entire machine. I poured the coffee, I smiled, and I began. That night, to count in earnest, to understand how I got there. Pouring wine for people planning to destroy me. You have to understand how carefully Damien had built my cage, and how he had handed me the key without knowing it. He married me 4 years ago. I was 26, working a quiet, unglamorous job in the back office of a financial firm. The kind of job where you are a name on no one's lips. And Damien Cross walked into my life like weather. He was dazzling. I will not pretend I saw through him. I didn't, not at first. By the time I did, I was already inside, already married, already, in his eyes, an asset. Because here's what Damien did. And it was clever. And it was his undoing. He needed names on his accounts that weren't his. Family names, trusted names, names with no criminal history and no obvious connection to betting. A wife was perfect. So over 4 years, he had me sign things, account openings, transfers, authorizations, always with a smile, always with the same line. Just paperwork, darling. You don't need to read it. It's boring. Sign here. He assumed I didn't read it. That was the cage. A wife who signed without reading was a wife who could be blamed without being able to defend herself. But I read everything. I cannot not read everything. And more than read it, I keep it. In a way I will let you understand fully later. But for now, know only this. When I sign my name to a document, I have read and retained every figure on it, permanently, exactly. 4 years of boring paperwork I didn't need to read had made me the unwitting keeper of the complete financial map of Damien Cross's empire. He gave me the map himself, one signature at a time, certain I was too trusting to look. The night after the French dinner, I tested how deep the cage went. I asked Damien, lightly, over breakfast, whether I should perhaps understand the family finances a little better, in case anything ever happened to him. A reasonable wife's question. His face did something cold and fast before the charm came back. "You don't need to worry about any of that," he said. "That's what I'm for. You just keep being you." He smiled. "It's why I married you. You don't clutter your head with things that don't concern you." Translation: stay decoration. Stay blind. Do not start looking now. And Nico, his right hand, was at the apartment more after that, always around, driving me to lunches I hadn't asked for company at, waiting outside rooms, a constant, pleasant shadow. I understood what he was, after the French conversation. Damien had set a watcher on the decoration, just in case the decoration developed thoughts. So they were watching me. Good. Let them watch the wife who knew nothing do nothing. Because the thing I was doing did not look like anything. It happened entirely behind a still face and a pleasant smile, in a place no watcher could follow. I was taking the 4 years of numbers I already carried, and I was beginning, quietly, to assemble them into the one thing that could end Damien Cross. Not a threat, not a confrontation. A map, complete, exact, and entirely in my head, of where every dollar was, who it touched, and the single thread that pulled would unravel all of it. They had 4 years to wonder what the decoration was thinking. They never once asked. The investigation Damien mentioned at dinner had a face, and her name was Priya Anand, and she found me before I found her, which surprised us both. She was the journalist sniffing too close. The risk Damien had planned to solve by handing them me. And she was good. Good enough that she had traced the edges of Damien's operation to the accounts, and good enough that she had noticed the name that appeared on so many of them. Mara Okonkwo, Mara Cross now, on paper, but Okonkwo on the older accounts, my name, everywhere. Exactly as Damien had arranged, so that when the structure fell, it would fall on me. Priya approached me at a charity luncheon. The kind of glittering World Cup adjacent event where the wives of powerful men are displayed like the trophies the tournament hands out. She sat beside me, made small talk, and then said, quietly, without looking at me, "I know whose name is on the Vasquez-linked accounts. I know it's yours. I'm giving you one chance to talk to me before this comes down. Because when it comes down, Mrs. Cross, it is going to come down on you. And you are going to spend your life paying for something I don't actually think you did." I looked at her, and I made a decision that I had not planned to make so soon. "You're right that it's going to come down on me." I said, "Damien's already decided that. I heard him plan it." She went very still. "But you're wrong that you know what I did. You don't know anything about what I did. No one does." I set down my glass. "Don't print anything yet. If you print now with what you have, you get me, and Damien walks. Because all the paper points at me, and he's spent 4 years making sure of it. You'll destroy the wife and miss the man. Then help me get the man." Priya said, "Not yet." I said, "You're being watched the moment you're seen with me. The man at the bar pretending to read his phone is called Nico, and he works for my husband. And he's been told to watch the decoration." I smiled, the bright, empty smile of a wife at a luncheon. "For Nico's benefit. Smile back at me. Laugh. We're discussing the gala. And when this is over, I will give you the entire thing, every account, every transfer, every name, in an order that takes down Damien and Renata Vasquez and leaves me standing. But it has to be complete, and it has to be timed. And you have to trust that I know the numbers better than you do." "How would you possibly know the numbers?" Priya said, laughing on cue, playing along. "Better than I do. She stopped, because she was too smart to finish the sentence the rude way. "The decoration." I finished for her. "Say it. It's what everyone says." She didn't. "Just trust me. Priya, the decoration has been reading. For 4 years." I stood and laughed again for Nico, and left her at the table with the first real question anyone had asked about me in 4 years, sitting unanswered in her eyes. How would the wife who knew nothing know the numbers better than the journalist? She was going to find out. "So are you—" Renata Vasquez was the dangerous one. And Renata Vasquez started watching me. And that was a different and sharper kind of problem than Nico. Nico watched my body, where I went, who I sat with. Renata watched my mind. She was the only one in the operation with the intelligence to wonder whether the decoration might be more than decoration. And 3 days after the luncheon, she invited me to lunch alone, just the two of us. And she spent 90 minutes hunting for what I was. She was extraordinarily good at it. She circled. She set small traps in conversation, mentioned figures that were slightly wrong to see if I would correct them, named accounts to watch my reaction, talked about the business in front of me more openly than she ever had, fishing to see if I leaned in. It was the interrogation of a brilliant woman, disguised as lunch between friends. And I survived it by being exactly what they had always thought I was. When she named a figure that was wrong, I did not correct it, though every cell in me wanted to, because I knew the right figure to the dollar. When she mentioned an account, I let my eyes stay pleasantly blank, though I could have told her its balance and its history. When she opened the door to the business, I changed the subject to the gala and the dress I couldn't decide on. The most boring decoration in the world. "You and Damien," Renata said finally, watching me over her glass. "He tells me you take no interest in his work at all." "None." I said, "I wouldn't understand it. Damien handles all of that. I'm hopeless with numbers. Honestly, I can barely manage the household accounts." I smiled. Embarrassed. Charming. Useless. He finds it relaxing. I think that I don't bring work home. It was the most important lie I have ever told. And I told it perfectly. Because I had spent 4 years building the cover it required. I'm hopeless with numbers. To the one woman who would have ended me on the spot if she'd known the truth. I said I was hopeless with numbers, and I watched her decide to believe it, because it fit everything she'd been told, and because a woman as sharp as Renata Vasquez could not quite imagine that someone could carry what I carried and show nothing. She relaxed. By degrees. The decoration was just decoration. Damien had been right. But at the very end, as we stood to leave, she said one more thing, lightly. And it was a warning, wrapped in silk. "It's a good marriage," she said. "You and Damien, you should protect it. Men like Damien. When they feel a marriage has become complicated, they simplify it." She smiled. "You're happiest as you are. Don't become complicated, Mara." She was telling me, woman to woman, that she knew Damien's plan to hand me over, and that my safety depended entirely on my remaining too stupid to be worth eliminating sooner. Stay decoration and you stay alive a little longer. Become a threat and you become a problem to be solved. I thanked her for lunch. I told her the gala dress was going to be the green one, and I went home and pulled for the first time on the single thread I had been saving. The one account buried in the structure that I had realized weeks ago was the keystone. The one that, in the right hands at the right moment, collapsed everything. I just had to live long enough to hand it over. Damien moved up his timeline, and I knew it the moment he changed how he was kind to me. He became suddenly attentive in a way he had not been in years. Gifts, a weekend planned, and folded into the tenderness. Paperwork, more documents to sign than ever before, a flurry of them, all at once, all boring, all needing my signature right now. "Darling, just here, just initial there. I read every one, the way I read everything." And I understood exactly what he was doing. He was loading the gun he intended to point at me. Every document in that flurry deepened my apparent ownership of the operation, moved more of the structure formally under my name, built the case that I had run it. He was preparing the version of events where his foolish wife was the mastermind. And he was doing it fast, which meant the moment he planned to hand me over was close. The investigation was tightening. He wanted me fully wrapped and ready to give to the authorities before it reached him. So I did something that frightened me more than anything in this whole story. I kept signing. I sat at his desk and I smiled, and I signed every document he put in front of me. All of it. The entire case against myself. Because I understood something Damien did not. Every document he had me sign, believing he was building a noose for me, I was reading and keeping. And every one of them was also evidence against him. The transfers had two ends. The accounts had origins. A document that said the money was mine also said exactly where the money had come from and where it went next, and whose hands it passed through on the way. He thought he was writing my guilt. He was writing his own and handing it to the one person who could read the whole sentence. But signing it meant walking a blade, because the closer Damien got to handing me over, the closer I got to the cliff. If he moved before Priya and I were ready, I would be arrested as the head of a match-fixing empire, with my signature on everything, and no way to prove that the quiet wife had been the bookkeeper of her own frame, rather than its author. My entire defense lived in my head, in numbers no one would believe a decoration could know. That night, Nico drove me to a thing I hadn't asked to attend. And on the way, he said, casually, watching me in the mirror, "Damien says you've been seeing a lot of that journalist, Priya something." "The luncheon," I said. Bored. "She does the Gala committee." "Why?" "Just that Damien wouldn't like you getting close to a reporter." Nico said, "Reporters complicate things." He smiled at me in the mirror. And it was not a kind smile. "You don't want to be complicated, Mara." The same word Renata had used. They had been talking about me. The watchers were comparing notes. And the word complicated was being said about the decoration. And I knew what that word meant in their mouths. My time was running out. I had to hand over the keystone. And I had to do it now. And I had to do it in a way that took them all down at once, before any one of them could simplify the problem of me. The night it broke open was the gala. Of course, these things always happen at the glittering event, because that is where all the players are gathered in one room, dressed beautifully, certain of themselves, and least prepared to come apart. It was a World Cup charity gala, an enormous one. The host city's powerful and the tournament's famous, all in one ballroom. And Damien's entire operation was there. Because operations like Damien's love a gala. A gala is where the money meets the glamour and shakes its hand. Damien, golden in the center of the room. Renata Vasquez, watching everything. Nico at the edges. The banker. And me, in the green dress. The decoration, on my husband's arm. I had spent the days before the gala doing the only thing left to do. I had given Priya everything. Not on paper, at first. In a single afternoon. In a parked car where Nico could not follow. I had recited it to her. Every account, every transfer, every name, every figure, every country. The entire 4-year map of Damien Cross's empire, in the exact order that would collapse it, starting with the Keystone account and following the thread out to every hand that had touched the money. Priya had recorded it, and then, crucially, she had done what I told her to do. She had taken my exact, specific, impossible-to-guess account numbers and dates to the people who held the actual records. And she had matched them, one by one, and found every single one real. By the night of the gala, the wife who knew nothing had handed a journalist a complete, verified map of a criminal empire, and not one of the men in that ballroom knew the decoration had done anything but choose a dress. At the gala, Damien made his move, and I had known he would, because I had read the timeline in his behavior. Midway through the evening, he drew me aside, tender, and told me there were some men he wanted me to meet tomorrow. Just a formality. Some business associates who needed to ask me a few questions about the accounts. Nothing to worry about. He would be right there with me. The handoff. Tomorrow he was going to deliver me to the authorities as the head of his ring. With himself beside me as the betrayed husband, he was telling me to my face. Dressed as care. And he was certain I was too trusting to hear it. "Of course, darling," I said, "whatever you need." And over his shoulder, across the ballroom, I caught Priya Anand's eye, and I gave the smallest nod. She nodded back. It was done. The story, with everything I had given her, fully verified, was going to break in the morning, before Damien's handoff, naming Damien and Renata and the structure, with the decoration nowhere in the frame except as the source. I should have simply waited for morning. But Renata Vasquez had been watching me all night, and Renata Vasquez was the dangerous one. And as I stepped away from Damien, she crossed the room and took my arm and said, very quietly, in French, certain I could not understand.
The journalist just nodded at you.
Why would a journalist nod at the decoration?
And I made a choice. I was done being decoration, and morning was only hours away. And I was so tired of the green dress and the empty smile and 4 years of pretending to be hopeless with numbers. I answered her, in French, because she nodded. I said to Renata Vasquez, in French as fluent as her own, "At the woman I'm about to become." I watched it hit her. The decoration had just spoken French, the language they had used in front of me for years, the language Damien had planned my downfall in across a dinner table while I poured the wine. I watched Renata Vasquez understand, in the space of one breath, that every conversation they had ever had in front of me, certain I couldn't follow, I had followed. "You understand French," she said slowly, still in French, testing the edge of the catastrophe. "I understand everything," I said. "I always have. I understand French, and I understand the accounts. And I understand that my husband is planning to hand me to the authorities tomorrow morning as the head of an operation I never ran." I switched to English, because the next part I wanted said plainly, "And I understand numbers. Renata, you asked me at lunch if I take an interest in Damien's work. I told you I was hopeless with them. That was the only lie I've told you. I'm not hopeless with numbers.
I'm extraordinary with them. It's the only thing I've ever been extraordinary at." Her face had gone the color of ash, because a woman as intelligent as Renata Vasquez did not need it spelled out. She was already racing ahead to the only conclusion that mattered. "The accounts are in your name," she said. "Every one." I said, "Damien put them there so I'd take the fall. He had me sign for 4 years. Certain I never read what I signed. I read all of it. I kept all of it. Every account, every transfer, every name, every number. 4 years of it, exact." I leaned in, the way they had all leaned in to say cruel things in front of me. Certain I couldn't hear. "I know where all the money is. Renata, I'm the only person alive who knows where all of it is. Damien doesn't even know. Not the whole map. Only the bookkeeper knows the whole map. And you all decided the bookkeeper was decoration." Across the ballroom, Damien had seen us talking, and something in Renata's frozen face had alarmed him. And he was coming toward us, golden and smiling. Through the crowd, "Whatever you're thinking of doing," Renata said, very fast, very low, "You'll go down with us. Your name is on everything. You said it yourself. My name is on everything." I agreed, which is why I didn't go to the authorities. They'd see my name and stop looking. Exactly the way you all planned. I gave it to a journalist instead, someone who'd follow the numbers past my name to yours. I smiled at her, and for the first time in 4 years, it was my own smile. Not the decorations. It runs in the morning. Renata, everything. Verified. Every account number I recited to her matched the real records, because I never get a number wrong. "You have until sunrise to be somewhere other than here." And Damien arrived, beaming, oblivious, sliding his arm around my waist and said, in English, to both of us, "What are my 2 favorite women conspiring about?" Renata Vasquez looked at him with an expression that has stayed with me exactly, the way every detail stays with me. And she said, in French, so he would understand and I would too, "Your decoration has been reading the books for 4 years. She has everything. It runs in the morning." He turned to stare at me, and Renata pulled her arm free and walked fast toward the exit. Already gone. Already saving herself. Damien Cross looked at his wife. The decoration, the foolish, trusting woman he was going to hand over in the morning. And for the first time in 4 years, he actually saw me.
"What did you do?" he whispered.
I read the paperwork. Damien. I said, all of it. You should have let me keep being decoration. It was my best quality. You cannot unprint a verified story. And Priya Anand's story printed at 6 in the morning. And by 7, the world Damien Cross had built was already coming down. It came down in the right order, which was the entire point. The order only the bookkeeper could have designed. It did not start with my name. The name on all the accounts. The name Damien had spent 4 years making into the perfect target. Priya's story started with the Keystone account, the one buried thread I had identified weeks before, and it followed the money outward from there, account by account, transfer by transfer, naming Damien Cross and Renata Vasquez, and the structure of the operation. With every figure exact and every account number already matched against the real records, before a word was published. By the time my name appeared, deep in the story, it appeared exactly as I had built it to appear, as the source, the wife who had been set up to take the fall, who had instead quietly documented the entire operation and handed it over. Not the mastermind, the witness. The one who knew where everything was because she had been forced to sign for all of it. And, unlike everyone assumed, had read every word. Damien's plan to hand me over collapsed because you cannot hand over the prosecution's chief source as their suspect. The frame only worked if I was silent. I had spent 4 years being so silent, they forgot I had a voice. And then I used it. All at once, through someone who could make it carry. What happened to Damien Cross and Renata Vasquez, and the rest, is a matter of record now, handled in the proper rooms by the proper people. The financial authorities and the sporting bodies and the prosecutors who handed a complete and verified map simply followed it. The money was traced because I had told them exactly where it was. The accounts were frozen. The operation that had turned the most watched event on Earth into a laundering machine came apart in the daylight. The way these things do once someone who knows where everything is finally decides to say so. Damien tried, at the end, the only move he had left, which was to insist that I had run it all, that the accounts were in my name, that I was the true head and he the deceived husband. It was a good lie. It was the lie he had spent 4 years building. But you cannot frame a bookkeeper who kept the books. Every document he produced to prove my guilt, I could explain to the dollar. Because I had read it and kept it, where that money came from, where it went, why my signature was on it, and whose hand had actually moved it. A woman who can account for every figure in the empire, exactly, is not the woman who was kept ignorant of it. My perfect knowledge of the numbers, the very thing that was supposed to be impossible for a decoration, became the proof that I had been the one reading while they were the ones running it. Renata Vasquez, to her credit, had believed me at the gala and used her hours. Where she went is not my story. She at least had understood, woman to woman, what I was. A few hours before the rest of them did, Nico, the watcher, had watched the wrong thing the whole time. He had watched my body, where I went, who I met. He never once thought to watch my mind, because no one watches the decoration's mind. That was always the flaw in the cage. They built it around a woman they refused to see. And they handed her, signature by signature, everything she needed to take it apart. People ask me, the few who know the whole story, whether I married Damien knowing what I would do, whether it was all a long game. It wasn't. I want to be honest about that. because the truth is stranger and truer. I married Damien Cross because he was dazzling, and I was 26, and I did not yet know what he was. By the time I knew, I was inside, and I was afraid. And I did the only thing I have ever known how to do when I am afraid, which is the thing I have done since I was a child. I counted. I read. I kept. It is the thing I am. And it took me most of my life to understand it was a gift and not an affliction. I have a mind that holds numbers the way other minds hold music, completely, permanently, without effort or choice. As a girl, it isolated me. I was the strange child who remembered every figure, every total, every sum anyone ever said. As Damien's wife, it made me, without my planning it, the unwilling keeper of his entire empire, because he handed me the books believing I was too trusting to read them. And I cannot not read them. And I cannot ever let them go. For 4 years, I thought that was my prison, the knowing, carrying the whole map of his crimes in my head and being able to do nothing with it but stay silent and pour the wine. It was not my prison, it was the case, building itself one signature at a time, inside the head of the one person they were all certain was empty. I did not stay in that world after. People assume I must have. That a woman who can do what I do with numbers must end up somewhere glittering and dangerous. I didn't want glittering or dangerous. I had had enough of ballrooms and galas and men who called me decoration in languages they thought I couldn't speak. I work quietly now, where my kind of seeing is useful and clean. I help people trace money that powerful people have hidden, the way mine was hidden behind me. The defrauded, the setup, the ones whose names were put on things they never read, by someone who counted on them never looking. I'm very good at it. I read everything, and none of it ever leaves me. I always have, and it always will. And the green dress I gave away, if you are the one they call decoration, the wife who knows nothing, the assistant who just files the paperwork, the quiet one they speak so freely in front of because they are certain you do not understand and could not remember. I will tell you the only thing worth knowing. They are handing you the whole map, every day, one boring page at a time, because they cannot imagine you are reading it. Read it, keep it, and choose your own morning. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who handed you everything they shouldn't have? Subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. I'll see you there.